Hey everybody. Good evening. Hey, it's time to get on to the next section. Okay, this is number 3 of systematic site, processing. We're doing the systematic, prospecting method. And the third part is systematic site sampling, or how to sample your site for gold clues that can tell you how rich the site is and where you might look for more gold and where you shouldn't start looking any further because you're done. You're toast. You're cooked. So let's take a look at this. You are here. Right here we have this arrow pointing to stage 3. Stage 3 is where we, out of the 5 stages of gold sampling, we're looking at this gold finding process. I call the 5-stage systematic gold finding process. And what we have here in stage 3 is just sampling for gold. We do that after we've done our site survey and after we've done our previous research on this claim, the area we're going to be looking. So right now what we're trying to do is go in strategically and pick some places to sample for gold and some methods that we'll use to do the sampling. I won't go into the methods, but we'll talk about the sample itself and what we really, fundamentally must do at each site to call it a thorough sample. Okay, so let's take a look. Let me check on the Facebook and make sure everybody's alive and well. I wanted to bring up a point here, and that is we still have the systematic prospecting sale going on. It's good until Sunday evening, and then it's over. So there is an end to this. I forgot to mention that earlier, so I want to make sure that nobody claimed that they didn't know. Because I think I might have mentioned it, but I'm making it really clear right now. You have until Sunday evening, and then we take it back to the standard price. So for now, you'll want to go check it out at that link, sourdoughminer.com, systematic. And if you like it, that's great. Take advantage of it because it's a good price. I'll catch you then. Now back to our topic. So site samples. What we're going to be talking about here, and let me check to make sure everything's going through in terms of audio on the page, because we've had a problem with Mr. Audio this week. I want to make sure that you can hear me loud and clear. So we are looking right now. And there we are, Site Samples 3. And yes, we've got people on board, and we've got 5 comments in there. And are they telling me that they can hear me? And the answer is, good evening from Canvas, C.J. Walker, Bob Sheely's there from North Carolina, Art Sherwood's here from Maryland, Byron Brown's here again, and Chuck Morkin is here from Pennsylvania, and Bob says the audio is good. Thanks, Bob. Okay, so we're going to commence the execution of site sampling. Let's take a look at this. So to start with, I just wanted to kind of go over the concept. So you can see this picture here. This is my son, and we're sampling this one, big borehole. What we're doing here is not just digging out a site and looking for it with a high banker. We're going after this to strategically choose this area as a likely area where we expected to find gold. I'll tell you in a minute what we found. It was kind of interesting. And so part of what you do when you sample is you're going to be strategically choosing a place in a certain volume that you want to pull out, and then you're going to measure the amount of gold that comes out. The basic fundamental principle of site sampling is that you are in the process of evaluating the richness of your find, or you're just evaluating whether there is a find here at all. Now, when you're first sampling, what you're doing is discovering where the pay streak may be. Remember I told you those distributions yesterday? So you're looking to see where you can find the most concentrated area to spend your time on. And then at that point, you're going to start working your claim, really working it. And you'll be pulling out material, washing it, cleaning it, recovering the gold, and then returning the tailings to the locations so that people don't trip over your holes. So the idea here is, what and how much did I find? Now let's take a look at that in the whiteboard at this point. So when you're site sampling, the idea is I have a site and it's consisting of several layers of material. Big chunk of it is what we call overburden. I'll call it the big O. And then there might be some interesting stuff here. This is what we would call our pay layer. And then there's this chunk down here that we'll just call bedrock. Now, why do I bring this of interest? Well, because the majority of your material in this top section that we called overburden is leverite. We don't really find gold in this material, and a lot of people, that's all they sample. They look in this top layer and it's a foot or two thick and they think that they're done. There's no gold here, and they miss the fact that buried deep inside of here is perhaps their most extremely rich area right in here. It's just chock full of gold sitting on what? Bedrock. Hence, you'll hear me say it again. What are the 3 rules of sampling, and for that matter, of placer prospecting? Go to bedrock, go to bedrock, and if you can't go to bedrock, go to false bedrock. Okay? That's a different kind of bedrock, and I'll explain that in a minute. So in this case, what we're looking for is what was called the host rock, because when gold sits on top of something and it starts to vibrate, that's this whole layer in here. Let me pin it with a green brush at this point. So this whole zone right in here, when this flood season we just have been going through comes through this channel, by the way, the water's up above this down here, ripping, roaring down through this stream bed. When it roars enough, it'll start to erode into this material. And it'll erode, ideally, in the worst of cases, right down to where the gold is. All of this material goes into suspension with vibration up and down, okay? If you've ever gone to the beach and patted the sand and you look and it fills with water, or you do that with gravel and sand, you'll notice that if there's gravel on top, that gravel will disappear into the sand. Why does that happen? Because the gravel is denser than the sand particles with all the air gaps in between them, or water gaps. Same thing's true with gold. Gold is much denser, but it can't go down through any of that material until it lifts up and leaves a space where the viscosity and the density of the material makes it so that the gold, which is less buoyant than the rocks around it, can sink below the rocks and they float above. Hard to think of a rock floating, but yes, they float on top of this material. So what happens is this gold goes, the most dense material down here will go to the bottom. So another thing you'll find down in this region is going to be a lot of black sands, okay? A lot of particles that are denser, iron. If you start seeing steel or pieces from old cars or nails and things like that, they're nasty when it comes to metal detecting, but from the standpoint of a indicator of the potential of gold in a placer deposit, they're pretty high, especially if they're old and rusty and have corroded onto the rocks around them. Because one of the things that can happen is this whole area down here can become calcified and hardened and become a false bedrock. It's not bedrock, it's another type of material, or it can be clay laden. It can be full of clay that sticks together and forms a false bedrock. In that case, what starts to happen with this material is the gold starts sticking above it at the top layer of this false bedrock and the bottom of all of this other material, as though it were bedrock. Now, what you got to keep your eyes out for is that layer may be suspended above another layer that's just like the one with the X's above it, the red X's. And that is, it's just another riverbed, but somehow this thing got calcified on top, or a piece of lava got stuck over it, or who knows what made it stay put and form a hardened, calcified chunk of rock or clay laden, which clay is very sticky and doesn't come apart very easily when the floods go by. So something, all it has to do is be something that can endure those floods and vibrations. So once that happens, the gold stays put, goes to that point and stays put. So go to bedrock, go to bedrock, go to false bedrock. Prospector Jess. So that's kind of it for tonight. I just wanted to touch on, stage 3 site sampling. What we're going to be doing essentially during sampling is boring a hole through this material. Let's see if I can do this right. I'm going to be chewing out, well, let's see, not that color, choose another color, okay? Something nice and dark. Okay, so we're going to be chewing a hole through this, preferably, kind of in a relatively controlled pattern, so that we know the volume of the region that we've penetrated and how much material we pulled out at each layer. So essentially we're pulling out these sizable samples, a couple pans worth or a couple of sluice boxes full or yards or whatever you use for your metric of volume, and then we count the amount of gold that we find at each layer. So we have this layer 1, layer 2, and layer 3 and layer 4. And so what we want to know is, where's the pay layer? Which of these layers seems to be giving an indication that somewhere nearby in this strata, in this layered cake of overburden and bedrock, is the most gold, because that is the one we're going to investigate. And like I said, it may not be on bedrock. It may be in a false bedrock buried in a sill on top of this. You know, there could be a chunk of clay right up here that's stopping the gold from moving. And at that point, we want to kind of take a look in that area and be serious about the gold that might be trapped on top of this right here, these spots. Okay? And that would tend to indicate in this case that this sample set number 2 is our highest volume of colors that we find in the pans of gold that we're pulling out. So when we start seeing a larger volume or a larger number of gold specks in our pan, then we start suspecting that that area might be of interest for us to go horizontally and start, you know, kind of doing some more sampling to the sides. And that's it for tonight. I just thought I'd touch bases and see how you're doing, and we'll talk about stage 3. So tomorrow is going to be stage 4. Why are we doing all these site sampling and discovery topics? Well, we're doing it to emphasize the things that I teach in that 5-stage systematic prospecting process that's covered in systematic prospecting, this thing that I've got a link to right down here. So sourdoughminer.com, systematic. Take a look at it. Look at the, you know, it's a sales letter. No, you know, it's a pitch, okay? But it's a good one because it's a product that will help you find more gold. And that's really the purpose of this whole thing. And the purpose of the exercise we're going through this week is to show you some of the things that are covered in that and give you an idea of the kind of thing that you need to be focused on when you're looking for more gold. The systematic part comes in when you record that stuff and improve on it. We talked about it in the last few days, okay? And a couple weeks ago, I talked about the 5 different stages. So you can look that back up. That comes back to this front page, which is, you know, these 5 stages on this diagram represent what is really the process I'm focusing on. I want to take you through those 5 pillars, those 5 focal points that you'll each one leverage to the next one to improve the amount of gold and the odds that you'll find more gold as you go down toward the end. And of course the end is mine or move on, which is, do I find enough to really be worth it, or am I done for this site and I'm going to move to the next, or this particular subclaim, my particular sample hole I'm working, and I'm going to move to the next most likely one based on the map that I built earlier. That's the whole idea. You're cycling, 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 and moving fast. The key to finding gold, and lots of it, more of it, is repeatability, systematic efficiency improvement. So you're improving the amount of gold you're pulling out by increasing the efficiency at which you cover the sampling process and the mapping process and all that stuff. So, and then recovery ultimately, what kind of equipment you're going to use to pull out the gold that you found effectively. Or you're going to lease the rent the lease out, or, you know, what claim. You know, you can do a number of things at the end once you know what you got. And especially if you do a real systematic site survey with good samples. These samples can be shown effectively, and you can get a geologist in to really effectively certify that those samples are true. And now you've got a lease that you can rent out and make royalties on, or, you know, there's a number of options you get. But to start with, you just want to start the principle of sampling carefully and doing your site survey and your systematic process carefully. So that's what tonight's about, and I just wanted to touch bases with you one more time and talk about systematic prospecting and Prospector Jess. So we have sound and video is okay. Portland Gold Show Saturday and Sunday, says Byron. All right. How many of you are going? Make sure you're out there. Support those people. They've been flooded and snowed. Charles Hansen, and they've also been overcome in Oregon with regulations. They got the same kind of flu that California got with regulations. So need some prayer on that one. How can you determine how far bedrock is if you don't have the dirt removed, says Charles. Very good question. Let me just go back to the blackboard for one moment. And so let's say we have our site and our bedrock is down here. I'm going to paint that in a different color. For now, we're just going to go black and white. Okay. So here's our bedrock sill. We're going to make it a sill because that's just easy. And we don't know how deep this bedrock is. In fact, I'm going to make this bedrock a little more angular. This is our bedrock. going all the way down here. And this is our overburden layer. And all of our big boulders and cobbles and sands and gravels and junk are buried in this. How do I know how deep it is? Well, first thing I do is I look around, and over in this region, I might spy that there's an outcrop of, what is it? Bedrock, okay? I might also spy that maybe over here somewhere, there's another outcrop of bedrock. So I know somewhere between point A and point B, there's bedrock, but I don't know how deep any part of it is. Well, I would start sampling along the rims here to see if I can find the angle or dip that this particular strata takes, because that tells me a little bit about what I can expect and how many feet away from this I can kind of tell how far I'm going to go. It's not going to be perfect, trust me, especially not in places where you have like greenstones, which are really flimsy rocks. They tend to break off into big boulders, and then the boulders shift with the flow, and all of a sudden you've got an area that looks like it should have bedrock. But the principle's the same, and that is I'm going to go in and look for this slope based on some early sampling of this region right in here. And so, let's see that. Too bad they don't make an eraser, but let's just change the color of the pen for a moment here. So what I'm doing essentially is digging this hole right here, and I just kind of widen it out, and I'm detecting the slope goes here. I'm inferring that it's also all the way down to here just simply by the angle. There's a field called trigonometry, but you kind of get the idea when you're using a compass. Okay, so I'm using a compass meaning protractor. Okay, and on that protractor I have angles that can be discovered. Okay, and I'm looking at this angle. That angle will start off at some point, but it will go down so many feet here based on the steepness of that angle. 45 degrees, it's 1-to-1 ratio. If you get into trig, you're gonna need a trig table, sine calculation. Okay, and what you're essentially doing is taking the sine of this angle and multiplying by the radius. Okay, but what you're going to do here is you're going to just simply, in this world, if it's 45 degrees, it's 1-to-1. If it's 30 degrees, it's about half that, and so forth. And so what you're doing is just kind of getting a rough estimate of how deep it is based on the angle. That's kind of the upshot, Charles. And so short of that, you would have to do some other like core sampling. That's another way you could find out how deep it is. You can core sample down through here and take it right down into bedrock and find out what's down there. Another method that wasn't used on Gold Rush, but could have been on that famous waterfall, because it's not that expensive when you're talking about putting $1 million of equipment in there, and that is you can put what's called a jitterbug out, and you can put a little stick of dynamite or a M80 kind of thing in here, a charge, and you essentially cause an acoustic blast to echo off of all this material and go back up into this unit right here, and that goes into a computer and answers the question of what are all the layers and how deep are they, what are the angles, and where can I find them. And there's a whole process of seismic testing is the field, and you can find out what those layers look like. Now, had they done that, they would have easily seen where the waterfall was. They would also have an idea of the kinds of materials. They wouldn't necessarily see the specific boulders, because it gets fuzzy when you're talking seismic. The wavelength versus the size of the material is such that it is really a fuzzy image at best. But it'll definitely show things like a bedrock interface. This whole thing would stand out like a boom, big headlight. Stuff in between would be kind of fuzzy. What you typically get is little parabola parachutes over these big boulders because of how they kind of affect the seismic waves. But they look like fish on a fish finder, okay? So what you're going to end up with is a kind of a picture that gives you a feel for what's down there and what you're up against in terms of, they could have known that how many yards. It was 100 feet down before they got to the pay streak. pay streak was awesome once they got there, but guess what? They weren't prepared for it. And that's the lesson learned there is they spent too long and too much money getting down there and used kind of the wrong equipment almost all the way until they got to the very bottom. And so it's just unfortunate that it had gone that route. Part of the problem was how close that waterfall was to the existing riverbed and how much riparian material, because remember that river was actually cutting into this section over here, if you will. And so they were trying to dig a sand pit right next to a river. Not a good idea. Not good at all. And they started discovering that in the last little episode there, just a couple years back, that famous waterfall in the first season. And so the idea is, yeah, seismic, that's another way to find bedrock. But that's not something you can practically do unless you have, a simple seismometer. I used one in college. It was kind of fun. It was simply a measurement instrument that measured the time for the wave. And then all we did was hit a sledgehammer and a sensor. That's the two things we had going into this device that measured the travel time through the acoustic wave when it first hit the sensor on the sledgehammer, sensed when the pulse went out. And that compared to a sensor on the other side and said, how much time did it take for it to get over to there? Now that distance was a fixed constant. And so what we did is we just kind of moved that thing around and took numbers by hand and then did what they call a move out correction. It's a bit of math to adjust for how the travel time changed. When you plot that on a plot, you can see these bottom edges, and it was funny. We could see sewer lines. We did it in somebody's city street in La Jolla, California. That was pretty fun. You can see all these college kids banging away with a sledgehammer on the street, with a bunch of technical equipment that looked like it came from the 1940s. So, but that's the idea. You can find the bedrock many ways, not the least of which is simply dig. But the principle is still the same. You got to dig to bedrock or you're not done sampling. Now, if you don't find bedrock, do you give up? Maybe, if it's going too long, too far, and not finding anything, and your number 2 position promised to produce better gold faster, then go to number 2 position on your sample, plan. We talked about claim site survey in the last section, number 2. Go to that point and start doing your dig there and see if you find bedrock earlier. If you find it earlier than you find it in this location, now you at least have a feel for, it's a minimum slope of this much. It's got to be more than that because it's deeper over there. We just don't know how deep. Okay, so now follow bedrock that way. And if you find it gold on that other one where it's shallower, then it's quite possible the deeper one will produce even more gold. Why? Because gold rolls downhill. Downslope, downstream, downhill. Another tip. So that's about it, I think, for tonight. Just wanted to touch bases on sampling and sampling techniques. Danny Young is getting in some practice today. Gold in the pan. Awesome. Go for it. CJ Walker says, good info again tonight, and thank you. And Byron Brown says, could you field photograph existing bedrock examples for show examples? That's a real good one. I'll see if I can cook up a couple of pictures of, I can't show you here. Speaking of which, I was going to show you this picture over on the other side. Let's see, where are we? So right in here, okay, this is this sample hole we were digging. We didn't make it to bedrock. We expected to get to bedrock based on the fact that there's bedrock right here in the bushes over on this other side. So we assumed that this thing would be a layer maybe a foot or 2 deep. We went down over 6 feet in this hole and didn't get to bedrock. So it's a really steep slope down there. We also know that over here we found some good gold. So down in here our assumption was we should find some really good gold. Well, we still have to go prove that. And the problem is it flooded in when we got back there. It kind of made a mess of that whole area. So we'll have to go back and dig it all out again. And not to mention high banking, dredging, and all that junk. But that's another story. But you get the principle. So yeah, I could look at getting you some pictures of what I mean by bedrock and how you distinguish it from the surrounding. Because bedrock is another term for bedrock is country rock. And what it really means is this is the rock that's been there forever and was part of either an intrusive body. It could have been an orogenic body, a mountain building body, but it's some body of rock that was there and is the base for all water flow. Remember, rocks and water tell you where gold is. So all the water flow works on that surface as its base. And the reason you want to go to bedrock is that the water won't flow any further, and neither will the gold. But the gold may find cracks in the bedrock, and that's something, a whole nother discussion for exploiting later. So I think that covers what we were going to touch on tonight, and I'll look into photographs for bedrock and examples, and we'll get back to you. Good question, Byron. Really good. Thanks for bringing that up. You know, it's fun interacting. I just wanted to touch bases on that too, because you know sometimes it feels like it's a one-way ticket. I'm just all all out and no input. And it's great to have this interactive talk, because I don't think of the questions that are in your head. And I'm leaning more and more toward having more of that interaction as part of our daily process, or at least weekly. And so I'd like to know what your feelings are on that kind of thought as well. And also I'd like you to really seriously consider the systematic prospecting thing below. Take a good look at it, because that'll kind of get you going, and it has some pictures of things like bedrock and minerals and rocks and stuff like that in it, as well as water flow and those principles. So I am going to check out for the night, and good night, and we'll see you tomorrow. Good prospecting. Prospector Jess over and out, and happy Gold Rush Day. All right.